I couldn't tell you exactly when it started, the feeling that something had shifted. Not just in her, but in us. It was subtle at first, like the flickering of a light bulb right before it goes out. Small things, quiet moments that went unnoticed, unless you were looking for them. And I guess I was looking. Or maybe I wasn't looking enough, but I should have. Linda had always been the center of my world. 10 years of marriage, countless dinners, vacations, arguments, reconciliations. We had a rhythm, a steady beat to our life. But somewhere, over time, it started to feel like I was playing solo in a duet. I remember the night she suggested, "We need to save our marriage." It was a Thursday. I had just come home from a long shift at the office, my back aching from sitting for hours. Linda was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, papers scattered about. She didn't even look up when I came in, and that's when I should have known something was off. "James," she said, her voice soft, almost rehearsed. "We need to talk." I froze in place, the weight of her words sinking into me like a heavy stone. She hadn't said those words in years. Not since we went through that rough patch right after we bought the house. The kind of patch that, at the time, felt like it might break us but, in the end, made us stronger. At least, that's what I thought. "About what?" I asked, even though I already knew. The distance between us was palpable, like she was speaking from miles away. Linda finally turned to face me. There was something different in her eyes, an emptiness, or maybe it was just tiredness. Hard to tell. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she said, chewing her lip nervously. "I think we need to take a break from the routine. I think we need to save our marriage, you know?" I nodded, trying to process what she was saying. "You mean like counseling? More date nights?" She shook her head, her gaze flicking back to the papers on the table. "No, James. I mean we need to make some changes, some real ones. Get back to who we were before everything got so mundane." That's when I thought she was just feeling overwhelmed. Work, life, the house, the kids. She'd been stressed for a while, always rushing, always tired. But then she dropped the bomb. "I think it would help if we spent some time apart," she said. "You know, just for a little while. To give each other space. I've been reading up on these things. It's not like we're getting a divorce, James." Just a pause. The air left my lungs in a single rush. I didn't know how to respond. At first, I thought she was joking. But the seriousness in her voice, the way she avoided looking directly at me, I knew she wasn't. She was serious. "Linda, are you saying you want us to live separately?" My voice cracked, but I couldn't help it. It was like she'd just shattered the fragile glass of our life in one breath. She nodded slowly, carefully. "Not for long. Just a few months, maybe. I just feel like we've lost ourselves somewhere along the way. And I don't want to lose us completely. I think this might help." I didn't know what to say. The thought of being away from her, of waking up alone, of not having her there at the end of the day, it terrified me. But the last few months had been so tense between us, it was like we were just two strangers going through the motions. I knew she wasn't wrong. I just couldn't believe she was willing to put it into action. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind raced with questions, with fear, with disbelief. Was she planning to leave me? Was she having an affair? Was I that bad? That broken? The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, checked in with the kids, made small talk with her at dinner. But my mind kept racing. I had to know more. I had to find out what was really going on. And that's when I noticed the messages. I didn't mean to snoop. It wasn't like me. But when I picked up her phone to look up the address for a doctor's appointment, she'd asked me to check it. I couldn't ignore the notification on her lock screen. The name Nick flashed and I froze. It wasn't a name I recognized, but that didn't mean anything. Linda had plenty of friends, coworkers, people she knew. I wasn't the jealous type. Well, not usually. But something about that name stirred something deep in me. I pushed the thought down, but it wouldn't go away. I tried to ignore it, but the next few days were filled with little moments that seemed to make the suspicion grow louder. Linda was always texting, always busy, always on her phone when I wasn't looking. Then came the night I caught them. I'd stayed late at the office, working on a project, and didn't get home until almost midnight. I thought Linda would be asleep, but when I walked in, I saw the light under the door to our bedroom still on. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. No answer. The door creaked open under my hand, and I froze. Linda was sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in hand, eyes wide, like she was caught in the middle of something she didn't want me to see. I didn't have to ask. I knew. "James," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think." My heart dropped into my stomach. Her affair. It was real. She was silent for a moment, avoiding my gaze as if she couldn't face me. Then she whispered, "I'm sorry, James. I've been seeing Nick for the last 2 months. I didn't mean for it to happen. But he makes me feel alive again. I was trying to fix us, but I didn't know how. I didn't know what to say." My mind was reeling, and yet, somehow, all I could do was stand there, paralyzed as she confessed. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever felt. It was like a weight, an anchor in my chest that kept me from breathing. The pain wasn't just about her affair, it was about everything we'd built, everything I'd trusted, all of it falling apart in front of me. "I don't know how to fix this," Linda said, her voice breaking. "I love you, James. I do. But I can't give him up." And that was the point when I realized something. The woman I had been married to wasn't the same anymore. I had no idea who she was anymore. Or maybe, I had never really known. The shock of her confession hit me like a sledgehammer. I stood there in the doorway, her words replaying over and over in my head. I could barely comprehend what she had just said. Linda, my wife of 10 years, was having an affair with some man named Nick. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, it was the way she said them, the calmness in her voice, like it was something she had been rehearsing for days. She was sorry, she said, but she couldn't give him up. She loved me, but it wasn't enough anymore. She needed him. I felt like I was drowning. The foundation of everything I had known, my marriage, my trust in her, was crumbling to dust at my feet. And yet, as much as I wanted to scream at her, as much as I wanted to throw her out of our house, I didn't. I just stood there, numb, trying to process what had just shattered my world. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't look at me like that. I don't want to hurt you. But this is the truth. This is what I've been feeling." I didn't say anything for a long time. I just stood there, feeling like a ghost in my own home. Finally, I forced myself to speak. My voice was hoarse. "So that's it? You've been lying to me this whole time? And now you expect me to just accept this?" Linda looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt, but also something else I couldn't quite place. "I don't expect you to accept it. I don't know what you want me to say, James. I don't know how we got here. But I've been unhappy for a long time. And Nick, he makes me feel seen. Like I matter again." I wanted to rage at her. I wanted to tell her that she mattered to me, that I mattered to her, that everything we had built together was worth saving. But the words wouldn't come out. I didn't know what to do. I still don't know what I should have done. But instead of shouting, instead of throwing her out, I just walked out of the room. I couldn't look at her anymore. I didn't know how to. The next few days were a blur. Linda and I barely spoke. She would go about her business like nothing had changed, as if our marriage hadn't just been obliterated by her infidelity. Every time I saw her, I felt like I was seeing a stranger. Her voice, her movements, everything about her seemed foreign now. I couldn't escape the image of her and Nick together. The thought of her with him, it made my stomach churn. But I couldn't just let her go. Not yet. Something inside me, a stubborn part of me, refused to let this be the end. I wasn't ready to let her tear our life apart just like that. I loved her. Despite everything, I still loved her. And that love, it was suffocating. I told myself I would give her a chance. I would give her the space she needed. I would give her the opportunity to reconsider. But in the back of my mind, something darker was brewing. I had to know. I had to know everything. I couldn't just sit there, helpless, waiting for her to make her decision. I needed proof. I needed answers. The first thing I did was start looking for ways to gather information. I didn't want to, but it was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had to know what she was up to, where she was going, what she was saying. I couldn't trust her anymore. I started with her phone. I knew she kept it on her at all times, even when she was in the shower or on the other side of the house. She didn't know it, but I had already taken a look at her messages once before. Nick's name was still there, like an open wound I couldn't ignore. The messages were intimate. Too intimate. There was no denying what was going on. But I didn't have enough. Not yet. I started checking her email. It wasn't something I had ever thought to do before, but now I was desperate for answers. I found more messages. More than I wanted to see. She had been seeing him for months, it seemed. And from the way she wrote to him, I could tell she wasn't just feeling alive again, she was in love with him. She was in love with someone else. And that hurt more than anything. More than the lies, more than the betrayal, more than the affair itself. I was suffocating. I needed something to hold on to. I had to prepare myself. I had to protect myself, my future. If Linda wasn't going to fight for our marriage, then I would have to do it for both of us. I started looking into divorce lawyers. I didn't want to. I didn't want to think about it, but the thought of her moving on while I was stuck here with nothing, with her betrayal hanging over me, it was unbearable. I made some calls, set up consultations for the following week. I kept the papers in a drawer, hidden under a stack of old files. I hadn't signed anything yet, but I knew it was just a matter of time. Next, I set up a few recording devices. Nothing too obvious, just small, discreet cameras in the places I knew she'd spend time when I wasn't home. It felt dirty, like I was betraying her trust, but I couldn't take any chances. She'd betrayed me first. I needed to protect myself, to gather the evidence I might need if it came to that. Every day I watched her more closely, listened more carefully. She was careful but not careful enough. I knew when she was texting him, when she was thinking about him. I could see it in the way she smiled, the way her eyes would soften when she said his name. She wasn't even trying to hide it. I didn't confront her about the cameras, about the messages, about the preparations I was making for a divorce. I didn't need to. Not yet. The truth was, I wasn't ready to give up on her. Not yet. I wasn't ready to accept that the woman I had loved for so long could be so far gone. But every day it got harder. Every time I saw her, I could feel myself slipping away. I wanted to yell, to throw things, to demand answers. But I didn't. Instead, I watched. I waited. I gathered my evidence, one piece at a time. I told myself I was just giving her time. Time to think, time to choose. But deep down, I knew that choice had already been made. And when it came down to it, I was just a man holding on to a marriage that was already dead, waiting for her to pull the plug. I was no longer sure what I was fighting for. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let her win without a fight. The days dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I watched Linda as she moved through the house, going about her day like everything was normal, like nothing had changed. The hurt I felt was slowly turning into something colder, more detached. She'd broken me, shattered my trust, and yet here she was, carrying on with her affair like it was the most natural thing in the world. It made me sick. It made me furious. But more than that, it made me realize that I couldn't just stand by and let her walk away from this without consequence. I couldn't let her walk away with a clean slate, with no accountability for what she'd done to our family. The thought of confronting her directly, of shouting, of begging her to reconsider, it was tempting. But I knew that wouldn't change anything. She had already made her choice. Nick had become a part of her world in a way that I couldn't understand, and I couldn't force her to love me again. So, I did the only thing I knew would give me some control. I started collecting evidence. It started small, like a seed planted in the back of my mind, something I'd thought about when I saw her texting him late at night or slipping away to run errands with no real explanation. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't just sit there, pretending that I was still in the dark while she carried on with her betrayal. The first step was her phone. I had already gone through her texts, but there was so much more I needed to see. So, I installed an app that mirrored her messages to my own phone. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it gave me access to everything she was doing. I could see the exchanges between her and Nick, their late-night conversations, their plans to meet up in secret. Every time she texted him, I knew. I hated myself for doing it. I hated that I had to sneak around in my own home, that I had to invade her privacy just to find the truth. But the truth was the only thing I had left. I kept my distance from Linda, playing the role of the husband who was trying to make it work. But every time I saw her smile, every time I watched her walk out of the house to meet Nick, I felt my heart break all over again. She didn't even try to hide it anymore. She would leave in the middle of the day, saying she had work to do or errands to run. I knew exactly where she was going. I didn't need to ask. I could see it in her eyes, the way she lit up whenever she mentioned his name. I set up the cameras next. It felt like an invasion of privacy, but it was the only way to capture the full extent of what was happening. I bought small, inconspicuous cameras that could be hidden in plain sight. One in the living room, one in the hallway, and one in the bedroom. I was careful not to make it obvious. If Linda found them, it would destroy whatever was left of our fragile relationship. For a while, the cameras didn't pick up much. She was careful, always making sure to keep her distance from me when Nick was around. But then one night the camera in the living room caught something. It was a Friday, and I had stayed late at the office. When I came home, Linda was on the couch and Nick was there too. I didn't know what I was expecting to see, but I wasn't prepared for this. Linda was sitting close to him, her hand resting on his leg, their faces inches apart as they whispered to each other. The warmth in her smile, the way her body leaned toward him, it was a scene I had never imagined. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just about sex. It was deeper than that. She was in love with him. I watched the video over and over again, each time feeling like a dagger was being driven deeper into my chest. I could hear the soft laughter between them, the intimacy that was no longer shared with me. And then I realized something that made my stomach turn. Nick wasn't just some fling. He was replacing me. The footage was damning. But I didn't stop there. I started documenting everything, every phone call, every email, every meeting. I kept track of all the times Linda had slipped away from the house, all the lies she had told me. I even started recording her voice, her conversations when she thought I wasn't around. It felt wrong, like I was betraying her trust in the same way she had betrayed mine, but I needed the evidence. I needed something to hold on to in case this went to court. And it wasn't just for the divorce, though that was becoming more and more inevitable. It was about preserving the truth, about making sure she didn't get away with this. I wasn't going to let her just walk away unscathed, with Nick by her side, and leave me with nothing. If she wanted to tear our family apart, then I would make sure she couldn't do it without facing the consequences. Each day, I got better at hiding my actions. I would come home from work, act like nothing was wrong, and pretend that everything was fine. But all the while, I was documenting her lies, compiling everything I could find, preparing for the day when it would all come to light. It wasn't just the cameras and the phone records. I had made a digital copy of every email exchange, every piece of evidence I had gathered. I stored it all in a folder on my computer, locked away where she couldn't find it. I even printed out some of the messages and stashed them in a drawer, just in case. I had to be ready. Some days I would sit at my desk, looking at the evidence I had gathered, and feel nothing but rage. I wanted to confront her. I wanted to scream at her, to throw everything in her face and demand that she explain herself. But I knew that wouldn't fix anything. It would only make things worse. So I stayed quiet. I stayed patient. It wasn't just about getting the upper hand. It wasn't about revenge. I had to keep telling myself that. This was about protecting what was left of me, about ensuring that Linda couldn't destroy me without facing the consequences. If she wanted to leave, if she wanted Nick, then that was her choice. But I wasn't going to let her take everything I had worked for without a fight. I watched her more closely now. I paid attention to every detail, every word. I was learning to read her, to anticipate her lies before they even left her mouth. The cameras kept recording, the phone app kept sending me updates, and my files grew thicker every day. It felt like I was becoming someone else. A man who was no longer in love with his wife, but who was instead driven by the need for justice. There were nights when I would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how everything had changed. How the woman I loved, the mother of my children, had turned into a stranger. And yet, I kept going. I kept documenting. I kept collecting evidence. Because, at the end of the day, All I had left was the truth. And I was going to make sure it was known. I gave her every chance. I wanted to believe that Linda still cared, that we could somehow salvage our marriage, that I could win her back. But each time I tried to reach her, each time I pleaded with her to reconsider, she pulled further away. I would sit across from her, my voice trembling, trying to find the right words, trying to make her see the damage she was doing, not just to me, but to our family. I told her I didn't want a divorce. I didn't want to give up on us. I told her I still loved her, and that I was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. But it was like talking to a wall. She would sit there, eyes lowered, avoiding my gaze, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cup, like she was somewhere else entirely. And then there was Nick. Every time I brought him up, she would get defensive. She would insist that it wasn't about him. "It's not Nick, James. It's about me," she would say. As if that made it better. As if that justified everything. But it wasn't just about her, it was about the choice she had made. She had chosen him over me, over us. And no matter how much I begged, no matter how much I cried, it didn't change anything. She wanted him. I couldn't accept it at first. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that after everything we had been through, everything we had built together, she was willing to throw it all away for a man I didn't even know. But I had to face the truth. Linda had made her decision. She didn't want our marriage anymore. It wasn't just the affair, it was everything. The way she had distanced herself from me, the way she stopped trying, stopped caring. She had been so wrapped up in Nick that she didn't even try to hide it anymore. It was as if she was daring me to catch her. And I did. I caught her every single time. So I did what I had to do. I changed the locks on the house. I knew it would be a mess, that it would cause a scene, but I couldn't stand the thought of her coming and going as she pleased, slipping in and out of our life like it meant nothing. The house was mine. It wasn't hers alone anymore. The first time she tried to come home after I changed the locks, I saw her standing on the front porch, ringing the doorbell like she had every right to be there. I didn't open the door. I just stood inside, watching her through the window. She looked different, older, more tired, but also lighter, as if the weight of the marriage had been lifted off her shoulders. She called me, of course. She screamed at me, accused me of being petty, of trying to punish her. She said I was destroying everything. But the truth was, she had already destroyed everything. I wasn't the one tearing apart our life. She had made that choice long before I ever changed the locks. I told her to go stay with a friend, or with Nick. I didn't care where she went, as long as she wasn't in my house anymore. But she didn't want to hear it. "You're being unreasonable, James," she said. "I don't understand why you're doing this. I love you, but I also love him. I'm not choosing between you, okay? I need both of you. And I'm not going to apologize for it." Her words hit me like a slap. It wasn't just that she was admitting to the affair again, it was the way she said it. So casually. So coldly. Like she was entitled to both of us. Like I was just supposed to accept it. I hung up the phone, unable to take another word from her. I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand the thought of her with him, of them continuing their relationship while I sat here, in this empty house, pretending I didn't care. But I did care. I cared more than anything. And that's when I decided to take matters into my own hands. The next time Linda tried to meet up with Nick, I decided to make sure she wouldn't have the chance to enjoy their time together. I knew their routine by then, how she would sneak out after dinner, leaving me alone to watch the kids or do whatever it was that I did. That night I followed her. It wasn't hard. I knew exactly where she was going. The same restaurant. The same table. Nick would be there waiting, smiling at her, whispering in her ear. I could already picture it in my mind. But I wasn't going to let her have that. Not tonight. I parked across the street, watching them through the window. It wasn't the first time I had done this. But tonight was different. Tonight, I wasn't just an observer. Tonight, I was going to take action. I waited until they were seated, their drinks in front of them, until Linda's smile stretched across her face in that way that always used to make me feel like the luckiest man alive. I hated it. I hated that she was so happy, so at ease with him, when I was sitting at home, in a house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by the ghosts of our past. I got out of the car, my heart racing. I walked into the restaurant and sat down at the bar, pretending to browse my phone, waiting for the right moment. I didn't care what people thought. I didn't care if they recognized me or if I looked like some kind of madman. When the waiter came over to their table, I made my move. I got up and walked over, deliberately bumping into their table. "Sorry," I said, looking directly at Nick. He froze, clearly not expecting the confrontation. "I didn't realize I was interrupting your little date night." Linda's eyes went wide, her face flushing with embarrassment, but I wasn't done. "Tell me, Nick," I continued, my voice louder now, enough for everyone around us to hear. "How does it feel to be the guy who's sleeping with a married woman? You think you're a man of honor? Because, trust me, you're not." Nick stood up, his chair scraping across the floor. He looked at me like he was about to say something, but before he could, I was already out the door. Linda didn't follow me. She didn't chase me down the street. She didn't even try to call. She just sat there, humiliated, probably feeling embarrassed for herself and for him. And I felt something. Satisfaction, I guess. It wasn't about hurting her. It wasn't even about getting revenge on Nick. It was about me regaining some control. About showing her that I wouldn't just let her walk all over me. I didn't expect it to make her change her mind. I didn't expect her to come crawling back, begging for forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, it would make her think. Maybe it would make her see that I wasn't the weak man she thought I was. The next day, I got a call from Linda. She was furious, of course. But it was more than just anger. There was a quietness in her voice, something I hadn't heard before. She was angry, yes, but she was also unsure. "You really think you can just ruin everything?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Do you think that's going to make me change my mind? That's not how this works." I didn't say anything. I just hung up. The house felt empty that night, and I knew the next steps had already been set in motion. It wasn't about making her love me again. It wasn't even about making her see the truth. It was about me fighting for what I still had, for the family I wanted to keep, even if she had already made up her mind. And I was going to make sure that if she wanted out, she would leave with nothing. The weekend Linda spent with Nick had been the final straw. I could see it in her face when she returned, the way she tried to act casual, like nothing had changed. She stood at the door, hesitating for a moment, as if she expected me to welcome her back with open arms, like the past few months hadn't happened at all. But I wasn't the same man anymore. The man who had begged for her to stay, who had pleaded for her to reconsider, was gone. In his place was someone colder, someone who had seen the truth and couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood there, watching her, letting the silence stretch between us. She finally spoke, her voice soft, uncertain. "I was thinking about us, James," she said, taking a step toward me. "Maybe I've made a mistake. Maybe we should talk." I couldn't believe it. After everything, after what she had done to me, she thought she could just walk back into our home and everything would magically fix itself. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "No, Linda. There's nothing left to talk about." My voice was flat, devoid of any emotion. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing how much her betrayal still hurt. "You've made your choice. You've made it over and over again." Her face fell, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something, guilt, maybe. But it was fleeting, gone before I could fully register it. She stepped forward again, reaching for me like she wanted to touch me, like she wanted to apologize. But I couldn't let her. I couldn't let her get close enough to hurt me again. "Don't," I said, stepping back, my voice sharper now. "I'm done, Linda. I'm done with this. I'm done with you." I saw her flinch, but I didn't care. I couldn't care anymore. She had taken everything I gave her and thrown it away like it meant nothing. I wasn't going to let her back in. Not after what she had done. The next few days were a blur of paperwork, calls with lawyers, and planning the next steps. I had already started the divorce process. I wasn't wasting any more time. Linda had left me with no other choice, no other option. But there was something else I had in mind. I wasn't just going to let her walk away from this. I wasn't going to let Nick walk away, either. I'd heard about this thing called alienation of affection. It was a law in some states, a way to hold a third party accountable for breaking up a marriage. I didn't care if it sounded petty or vengeful. I was done being the victim. I called a lawyer. We filed the papers. I sued Nick for alienation of affection. The idea of dragging him through the mud, of forcing him to face the consequences of what he had done, it felt good. For once, I wasn't the one suffering silently. Then, one morning, I got a call that made my blood run cold. It was from a woman, Nick's wife. Her name was Claire. She'd heard about the lawsuit and wanted to meet. I didn't hesitate. I agreed to meet her, to listen to what she had to say. When I met Claire, I saw the same pain in her eyes that I had felt in mine. She was older than Linda, maybe a few years, but she looked just as broken. "I'm sorry," she said, after we exchanged a few words. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. "But Nick, he's been having an affair with your wife, hasn't he?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat was tight, my jaw clenched. "I want to fight back," Claire continued, her voice trembling but determined. "I'm filing for divorce, but I also want to sue him for what he's done to us." To me, I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt like I should comfort her, tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. I had nothing left to give anyone. Not after Linda. "I'm with you," I said finally. "Let's make him pay for this. Let's make them both pay." We exchanged information and agreed to go forward with the lawsuits. As twisted as it was, it felt like the only thing I could do to make sure Linda and Nick didn't just walk away scot-free. But there was still one more thing I had to do. One final act that would make everything clear, to both Linda and myself. The night I kicked her out, I was cold. I was detached. I felt nothing. She had come back to the house again, trying to talk, trying to fix things in the way she always had, by apologizing, by making excuses, by pretending like the past months hadn't happened. She didn't get it. She still didn't understand. "James," she said, voice pleading. "I know I've made mistakes. But I still love you. I want us to work this out. We can fix this, can't we?" I didn't look at her. I couldn't. "No," I said, my voice final. "There's nothing left to fix. You made your choice. Over and over. You chose him." She fell silent. I knew she wanted to argue, to beg. But there was nothing left for her to say. I walked into the bedroom and grabbed her wedding ring from the nightstand. It was cold in my hand, the diamond catching the light, like it was mocking me. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything, our marriage, the promises, the years, and I realized that it was all gone. I didn't hesitate. I didn't even feel a pang of regret. I threw the ring at her. "You don't get to keep this," I said. "You don't get to keep anything from this marriage. Not after what you did. Not after what you've chosen." Her eyes widened and I saw something flicker. Maybe it was surprise, maybe it was shame. But it was too late. It didn't matter anymore. "Get out," I said, pointing toward the door. "Pack your things and leave. I'm done." She didn't argue. She didn't fight it. She just turned and left. I watched her go, and it was like a weight had been lifted from my chest. The house felt quieter, emptier, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like my space. Like my life again. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. I wasn't the man who had begged her to stay. I wasn't the man who had cried himself to sleep wondering where everything went wrong. I was a man who was starting over. And this time, I wasn't going to let anyone destroy me. Not again.